Hi, everyone. I'm Bruno Coimbra. I work at Fermilab with the Glidein WMS team, and I'll be talking about the work that we did to transition Glidein WMS from the previous X509 tokens proxies that we used to use into GWT tokens. After that, I'll also talk about the work that we're doing to refactor how Glidein WMS deals with credentials, which was motivated mainly by this transition. So I believe most of you here know what Glidein WMS is. So for those who don't or need a refresher, Glidein WMS is a pilot-based resource provisioning for distributed high-throughput computing, which provides a uniform, reliable cluster. So what it means in practice is that this node app here, the front end, will be watching a job queue, a SCAD. And based on the jobs it finds there, the kind of jobs and number of jobs, it will contact this other node here, which is our factory, and request some Glidein submission from it. Glideins are our actual pilots. So the factory knows how to submit them, and will submit them to Conda clusters or cloud resources, Conda CEs. And these pilots will get there and get into the local queue. Eventually, these pilots will start running. Once they do, they will move into worker nodes. They'll do some specific work that we will mention in the next slide. But most importantly, they will eventually call back to a central manager, talk to collector, and join user pool, creating hence the virtual cluster that people will use to submit jobs. So Glideins are our so-called pilots. And what they do is that they land on worker nodes and they do some validation, right? So they will check cores, memory disk, among other resources. They will do some work to customize the worker node. They will set specific environment variables, install libraries, maybe deploy containers. But most importantly, it will spawn a startee, which is the counter component that will actually talk to the user pool collector. They register themselves as slots and start running jobs as they match the slots. For this presentation's context, what we really care about the Glideins here is that they are the ones responsible for handling pilot credentials and job credentials. As we mentioned before, the factory submits the Glideins to the sites, and they are the part which caches the credentials that it gets from the front ends. They will use it for two different purposes. One is to authenticate with the sites, and the second purpose is to forward some credentials to the Glideins that will be used during the job processing. The front ends request the Glideins to the factories, and what they actually do is that they try to maintain a constant pressure on the factories, or actually they request jobs to the factories to maintain constant pressure on the sites to make sure they won't overload the site queue. In our context here, frontends are the ones responsible for ingesting the credentials into the system, right? So they may generate credentials or get credentials provided by VO admins. They will handle short-term and long-term credential pairs, and they delegate credentials to factories and clients. So they are the component introducing the credentials in the system. So up until before the transition, the model that we had was the traditional X509 authentication with a pilot proxy. So in this model, we have a one all-knowing, all-present proxy. It starts here from the front end and will perform several purposes as it goes through the system. So the first one, it will be forwarded to the factory that will use it to authenticate with a CE, for example. This can also be used to talk back to the central manager when the pilot authenticates back with the user pool. And it can be used for service access, to register to storage services such as CVMFS, for example. Additionally, we also use a different credential, which might be something like an SSH key, to authenticate with the CE. So sometimes we'll not use the proxy itself to authenticate with the CE, but we are still sending the proxy along because it will be needed for all the other purposes here. Finally, we use X509 certificates to authenticate and identify our hosts for communication among them. Then, as we discussed here a couple of times during this week, we dropped support for X509 tokens, right? So we had to change, and there are several benefits to it. It's an industry standard. It's easier to use. We can have a more granular authentication system with different roles. In general, we improve security. The caveats, though, is that, well, we had something that worked, right? So GlideinWMS worked for quite a while with proxies, and now we have to replace the system. It now requires multiple credentials instead of just that one proxy that we had before. And credentials will have many scopes and purposes now. The generation and renewal of these proxies is different from what we used to do with the proxies. And most importantly, we need a transition period because we can't simply drop tokens one day, proxies one day and start using tokens the other one. So we had to come up with a plan for this transition. So in the new model, we'll use different credentials for different purposes. Our first credential here, which would be done with a proxy first to authenticate with the CE, is now one independent credential, right? So it's sent to the factory in the same way and used to authenticate with the CE. This can be something like a side token, for example. We have another one, which we'll use to access the resources that we had before here. That can be a VO token. We have ID tokens that we can use for monitoring. And other ID tokens for different purposes, which is authenticating back with a central manager to join the user pool. And this is also an example of a credential that the frontend generates. So the way GlideinWMS works now, it generates these ID tokens at will to authenticate back with SCADs. We may also have additional credentials that are sent along within the job, the user job, not the pilot here, that will end up inside the Glidein as well. We still need certificates, however, to authenticate the hosts. So X509 is not going away completely. And based on the experience that we had with it, we noticed that we needed to do something about our code and the way we handle credentials. So for a few reasons, one of them is GlideinWMS has been there for quite a while now, and the code has been going more and more complex with time. Adding support for tokens and different credential purposes would add complexity and depth to our functions handling those credentials. Basically, for every new credential, for every new purpose, we would probably have to add a new if clause somewhere. And we are now also working with other front-end-like applications, such as the HaveCloud Decision Engine, that will need similar changes. And it would be really nice if we had a library that we could port to other applications such as this, so we only had to do this work once. So we came up with a few goals for these refactoring. With one important point here, this is a work in progress. So while these goals might not change, the way we're implementing them is still subject to change, but I'll touch more on that later. So the goals are, first of all, the way we handle credentials should be type agnostic, right? So behind the scenes, GlideinWMS should handle credentials in the same way for every credential type. So we should handle a token in the same way we handle a proxy. Also, credentials should serve specific purposes now. So we should not have these proxies which will do everything, and we don't know exactly all the purposes they have. So we should have these now well-defined and predictable. Authentication methods should be flexible and predictable. And these might have been a pain for some of you guys who needed to support hybrid systems, that you had to set up grid proxy authentication, and then to make sure we would still be able to send a side token with it, we would have sort of a hacky way on GlideinWMS that would send both proxy and token. And then we would have another knob, which be continue if no proxy. So we could authenticate using side tokens on a grid proxy authentication. Anyway, it gets quite complex, right? So we need to change the way authentication methods work. I mean, they should be more flexible. Additionally, we've also heard from site admins that they would like to be able to send an arbitrary number of credentials along with the Glidein, regardless on what they're being used for. And we should be able to specify additional authentication parameters, which we now have as sort of classifiers for, as qualifiers for credentials. Also, credentials now need to be generated on demand, so we should also support that. So for the first part of it is the least, that won't affect much GlideinWMS users, but behind the scenes, what we're doing is that now we have a generic credential class. It's an abstract class that implements basic functions such as loading from file, saving to file, decoding credential. And that is how the GlideinWMS code in general will handle credentials without actually caring about a type. So if we ever need to support new credential types, besides token and practice, which we have here, we would only have to implement the concrete classes for these specific credentials, and we wouldn't need to touch anything else in the code. GlideinWMS would simply be able to work with them with a new credential type. For purposes, now when you declare a credential in the GlideinWMS configuration, you should be able to specify what that's being used for. And these are just an example of names you can have. They are not final yet, but you could have something for the site authentication, authenticating back with the user pool, authenticating with services. And these credentials would either only be considered for matching if they are CE authentications, or they would be completely ignored during group and entry match if they are simply meant to be sent along with the Glideins. Now, talking about flexible authentication methods, this is an example that we have. So this is the proposed solution for now. We should be able to do something like this, right? So this is an example of having multiple authentication methods. So here we have two portions of this string. So the first one is one authentication method. The second one is a fallback authentication method. So the way we intend this to work is, for this proposed solution here, you would need one site token and one grid proxy to authenticate with a site. Now, let's suppose you only have a site token, but you do not have a grid proxy. Well, the first authentication method would fail here, but then you would be able to fall back to use just a site token. This is a more streamlined way of implementing what we had to do for the transition period, and these could be extended for other credential types as well. This is how VOs these days declare credentials on their front-end configurations. The only thing that changed here is that now you can also define the purpose for that credential. And by defining something like Glidein payload, it would be able to specify that that credential won't be used by anything for anything within GlideinWMS, except for being sent along with the Glidein. We now have parameters as an independent entity. Today, we have them as qualifiers for credentials, so they will now be an independent configuration here. They will be used during the matching process, but they will not be tied to credentials. So they will be considered for every credential independently during the matching process. Finally, we have credential generators. We already have these in production, by the way, which is a site token generator. We want to use the same model here to extend to other credentials. So the main idea here is that instead of giving a credential file, you actually give it a credential script that will be called every time we need that credential. That script will generate the credential and return it to the code, which will be used for authentication or whatever other purpose it might have. Again, the disclaimer here, this is a work in progress, right? So we are still working on these solutions. They may or may not change. But we would like to hear from you guys if you have any questions or requests or feedback on what we are doing. And if you do, you can either talk to one of us here or contact us through the GlideinWMS support email. And that's all I had. Thanks, everyone. I'll work for questions.